Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, the president pushes ahead after a shakeup at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and a resignation from the Fed.
The news from President Trump saying he will announce a new Federal Reserve governor and a new jobs data statistician in the coming days as he maintains last week's jobs numbers were, quote, rigged. The list of likely Trump picks for that soon-to-be vacant Fed governor's role and how the Senate could complicate matters for him.
Plus, Texas Democratic legislators flee the state to block redistricting efforts and now face the threat of arrest.
We know that you are making great sacrifices to resist the power grab that's being perpetrated by Donald Trump, by Governor Abbott, and by Texas Republicans.
If Republicans are willing to rewrite these rules to give themselves an advantage, then they're leaving us no choice. We must do the same.
The developing news as we come on the air with Texas Governor Greg Abbott ordering the arrest of state Democrats who broke quorum to stop the redrawing of Texas's congressional maps. We'll have more on what happens next with Texas State Legislator Chris Turner.
And after President Trump threatened action against Vladimir Putin, his threat to now substantially hike tariffs on India over Russian oil and the administration's potential last-minute bid for a deal with Russia as the clock ticks down to the president's Friday deadline. What we can expect when presidential envoy Steve Witkoff heads to Moscow this week. That is where we begin this evening with news from the president now threatening to substantially hike tariffs on India, accusing the country of fueling Russia's war in Ukraine, posting, quote, India is not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil, they are then, for much of the oil purchased, selling it on the open market for big profits. They don't care how many people in Ukraine, he writes, are being killed by the Russian war machine, unquote.
That announcement from the president coming as the Friday deadline he has given the Kremlin looms, with no sign of concessions from Vladimir Putin. Presidential envoy Steve Witkoff now set to be in Moscow later this week in a last-minute bid for a deal. And joining us now for more is Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics, who, of course, covers geoeconomics specifically for us. So, Jenny, obviously this is an attempt to influence not only Russia's behavior, but India's behavior when it comes to Russian energy. My question is it going to elicit the response from either that the president wants?
It could also be a third option, which is just creating leverage in trade talks with India and using Russia as the excuse for it. And I think what we see from New Delhi's initial response is it's not working in terms of getting India to back off. India has indicated that it's going to continue to hold strong. It's indicated it's actually going to focus on Buy India as a sort of response to de-risking from the United States. Still, we do think that India is interested in a trade deal with the U.S., and the question is, can they put together a deal that President Trump approves of?
How seriously should we take this post? However, when there's not even a number in there, we're not sure exactly what that tariff is going to be, the extent to which Donald Trump could be riffing.
I think there's a whole question looming over his entire threat of whether there's secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs around Russia and whether he'll actually follow through with that threat, given the immense economic impact that, in particular, his original threat of 100% secondary tariffs would have, not just on India, but China, which is a far bigger purchaser of Russian energy and Russian products in general, and according to prior U.S. assessments, far more critical to Russia's war machine.
Thank you so much, Jenny. As always, Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics with us live from Washington. For more insights on this, we turn to Kurt Volker, the former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations in the first Trump administration, as well former U.S. Ambassador to NATO during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Ambassador, great to have you back. It's good to see you. And I'm wondering your thoughts on, first, the rhetoric that we're hearing. President Trump invoking the Russian war machine sounds like a different person than who we were hearing from only weeks ago. And to the extent to which you buy this approach, do you take him at his word?
Well, look, everything that President Trump does here is tactical, and it's all aimed at trying to get an end to the war. He was hoping that he could do that by offering sweet deals to Vladimir Putin. Putin turned him down repeatedly and has continued killing people in Ukraine. So now he's trying the opposite approach. It is ratcheting up the tough talk, the rhetoric, the comment about the nuclear submarines, the tariffs, the sanctions, and so forth. And he's seeing whether that kind of pressure will work on Putin. Honestly, I don't think it will. And I think Witkoff's going to find that Putin is going to try to prevaricate, try to find little things he can offer to drag things out, but nothing substantial. As for the seriousness of these tariffs or sanctions at all, we have to see it when we see it. I think Trump is serious this time, but it's going to be a combination of factors. Sanctions, perhaps, tariffs on India, China, and so forth, but also a continued stream of military support to Ukraine, but on a paid-for basis, as he's already arranged with the NATO Secretary General.
Well, as you mentioned, NATO, Mr. Ambassador, we spoke with the U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ambassador Whitaker, earlier today on the early edition of Balance of Power, talking about how what you were just outlining, the U.S. providing more weapons through NATO countries that are going to be making these purchases of military equipment, coupled with sanctions, are designed to put adequate pressure on the Kremlin. This is what he told us.
There's no resolution on the battlefield. A diplomatic solution is the only way. I think secondary sanctions and tariffs against those that are paying for this war, like China, India, and Brazil, by buying the oil that Russia is producing, is an obvious next step to try to bring this war to an end. Russia is very good at avoiding sanctions and evading these things, but I think this is going to really hit them where it counts, and that is in their main revenue source, which is the sale of oil to these countries.
And I wonder if you share that optimism about hitting them where it counts. Is it hitting Putin hard enough when you just suggested you're not sure these pressures are enough to sway him?
Yeah, I think we have to do everything. You never know when enough is enough until it is. But what we should be trying to do is targeting, exactly as he said, the oil and gas revenue that's flowing into the Kremlin budget, which is then funding Putin's ability to keep the war going. India is a substantial buyer of Russian oil and is, as President Trump said, making a profit off it. But a lot of that initial purchase goes right into the Kremlin state budget. So this is worth going after. But then you have to keep layering on top of that. And what I would suggest is that in addition to the tariffs, which hit the country, I would go after the particular entities and individuals that are doing the business deals, the banks, the purchasers of the oil and gas, the insurance companies, anyone working with the vessels, the ports. All of those things ought to be subject to targeted sanctions as well to make those people not want to do it. And then, as is often underestimated, getting NATO involved and helping acquire and distribute weapons and ammunition to Ukraine on a paid-for basis is very significant. For 3 years, President Biden kept NATO out of this, deliberately wanted to avoid any NATO role in helping Ukraine out of fear of escalation. Donald Trump has just now put that on the table. And I think the logical next step on the military side with NATO is to help Ukraine develop a stronger, more layered, integrated air defense system to try to neuter the effects of Russia's nightly attacks.
Well, with all that said, Ambassador, we've got a deadline at the end of this week, as we have already invoked. Does Vladimir Putin care? Will he change any behavior in the next 5 days?
No, he won't. He'll live true to form, which is he'll offer something that sounds like it might be good when it really means nothing. It might be a phone call with him and Trump and Zelensky all on the line, or it might be that he'll drop one of his conditions for ending the war, which is rolling back NATO enlargement, but not his other conditions. Or he'll offer to send another delegation to Istanbul to meet with Ukrainians. But nothing is going to come out of those things. He's just stalling for time.
Well, so as we consider time, Ambassador, with the additional weapons being provided through NATO as a middleman that we were just discussing, with Russia's war machine as operational as it is right now, absent these sanctions or secondary tariffs going into effect, who has the stronger hand right now? If they were to come to the negotiating table at some point, who has the advantage?
Well, both of them are having difficulties. With Russia, they are taking a lot of losses in manpower, and they're having trouble replacing them. They keep turning to North Korea to get thousands more troops. They're having trouble replacing all of the military hardware that they're losing. And the state finances and the economy in Russia are definitely going in the wrong direction. So Putin is in worse shape than he wants it to appear. the same time, Ukraine has a smaller population. They've taken a lot of losses as well, and they continue to rely on outside support, which obviously Russia's not getting that much of other than China and North Korea. But Ukraine's getting a lot of outside support and still needs it. In the end of the day, it is Ukraine as a country, Ukraine as a people, as a national identity that is on the table here. And so Ukraine is simply not going to give up. They are defending who they are.
Is there anything beyond this program to provide weapons that the U.S. can do right now militarily to help Ukraine? We've got a couple of nuclear submarines, the president told us, have been headed to that region or to some region around Russia and Russian waters. Could we do what we've been doing in Israel, for instance, and play a defensive role in intercepting missiles that are headed to civilian neighborhoods in Ukraine?
Yeah. So that is one thing that we could do, and it doesn't even have to be American military action to stop the Russian missiles. We could task this to NATO, let NATO work with Ukraine to develop a multi-layered and much more strategic air defense system than they currently have. They have a hodgepodge of weapons from all different countries. This could be much better integrated. We could be giving the Ukrainians much longer range precision-guided munitions so they can take out airfields, aircraft, ammunition depots, fuel depots, go after all the military support that is enabling these Russian raids. And as you indicate, we could be supporting Ukraine more with air defense from neighboring countries, particularly Poland and Romania, without actually being in Ukraine. All of that trying to help protect civilians and help neuter the effects of Russia's nightly attacks. And then one other thing I would mention is we used to have on the books lend-lease legislation where Ukraine could borrow money from the United States and buy our weapons and ammunition. That expired in 23, but we should put that back in the mix as well as a signal to Putin that there's plenty more where this came from.
All right, Kurt Volker, thank you so much for joining us, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations in the first Trump administration and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO during the George W. Bush administration. We appreciate your time. Now, a renewed wave of dip buying lifted stocks today thanks to some solid earnings reports and building confidence that the Fed will cut rates sooner rather than later. We turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine?
Yeah, quite a turnaround from what we saw on Friday. All the concerns about that negative jobs report, all the concerns about the firing of the BLS leader, and, of course, a lot of concerns about the resignation of Adriana Kugler, the Fed governor. All of that apparently in the back mirror right there, as you see an S&P 500 up 1.5% on the day, recouping almost all of the losses from Friday, and a similar story for the other major indices, including the NASDAQ and including the Russell 2000. And this gets to the idea here of what's leading the market higher. Today, it was about, I think, 10 of the 11 sectors, but tech was on top once again. In fact, 6 of the Mag 7 names posting gains here on the day. And a lot of that really has to do with this idea that if you are looking for gains in this market, you look for the growth stories, and more importantly, you look for the cash flow stories. And we got a taste of that in the post-market today with Palantir. There's been a lot of talk about the AI trade and a lot of talk about NVIDIA, but what if I told you the best performing stock this year, the best performing stock since ChatGPT was introduced back in 2022 is not NVIDIA. It's that stock on your screen there. Palantir has more than doubled on the year, and it's up more than 2,000% since ChatGPT was introduced. And a lot of this has to do with the idea that not only is Palantir a big AI play, but it is actually a big government play, a company that has close ties to the Trump administration, a company with a lot of government contracts, and a company right now that a lot of people see as being one with a huge moat around it. So despite the high stock price, despite the high multiples, there are some investors betting that that 2,000% run since late 2022, that can continue deep into 2026.
Incredible story. Palantir describing the astonishing, as they call it, AI impact on business. Romaine, thank you. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick at World Headquarters in New York. Coming up on Balance of Power, President Trump says he'll announce a new Federal Reserve governor and a new jobs data statistician in the next few days. Following the resignation and firing we talked about on Friday, we'll have details. First, though, the new threat from Texas Governor Abbott to arrest the Texas Democratic lawmakers who fled the state to block Republicans from redrawing congressional maps. We'll be joined by one of those lawmakers, State Representative Chris Turner. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
tool they're using is a racist, gerrymandered map. A map that seeks to use racial lines to divide hard-working communities who have spent decades building up their power and strengthening their voices. And Governor Abbott is doing this in submission to Donald Trump.
That was Texas State Representative Gene Wu, who, along with a number of other Democratic state legislators, fled to Illinois, where they were greeted by Governor J.B. Pritzker. Others journeyed to New York and other blue states, including Massachusetts, in an effort to break the quorum necessary for Texas's Republican majority to finalize new congressional maps we've told you about that could wipe out as many as 5 Democratic seats. Texas Governor Greg Abbott has threatened to remove the absent Democrats now from office, giving lawmakers until 3 p.m. local time today to be back in the legislature or face that consequence. Now he is also threatening arresting those Democrats outright. Joining us with the latest from our Dallas bureau is Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief, Julie Fine. Julie, this development is something that we've discussed. Now that it's in place, how would this happen? You would extradite lawmakers from states like Illinois?
Well, yes, you would extradite lawmakers, but the question is, how do you arrest them? Governor Abbott has said that DPS now has the authority to go out and arrest them. DPS, however, is Texas Department of Public Safety. The question is, what happens when they get to other states? You've got Democrats right now in Illinois. You have Democrats right now in New York. You have Democrats right now in Boston. So the question is, how do they go into all those states? Governor Pritzker specifically said last night at a news conference with Democrats that he would protect and do everything he could, that he was welcoming them to their state. So that will certainly depend on how these governors react, but certainly something to watch within the next few hours. Joe and Kaylee?
All right, Bloomberg's Julie Fine, our Texas bureau chief, thank you so much. And just moments ago, Texas State House Speaker Dustin Burrows issued this warning to his Democratic colleagues who fled the state.
To those who are absent, return now. Show the courage to face the issues you were elected to solve. Come back and fulfill your duty, because this House will not sit quietly while you obstruct the work of the people. The people of Texas are watching, and so is the nation. And if you choose to continue down this road, you should know there will be consequences.
Joining us now, Democratic Texas State Representative Chris Turner, one of the Democrats who left the state. Former Texas House Democratic Caucus chair, was also part of the 2021 Texas Democrat state legislator walkout that you might have heard Julie Fine talking about. Representative, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. What will be different this time in affecting outcomes? I realize you're trying to shine a light on what's happening here in Texas, but I believe it was after 5 weeks in 2021, Democrats ended up trickling back into the state and the process continued. Is that how this ends as well?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, look, a quorum break is an extraordinary measure to take. Quorum breaks do not generally alter the ultimate outcome of the legislation. We all know that. Yeah. But this is such an important issue. We have made the collective decision that it is vitally important we do whatever we can to delay this process and use every single day to raise awareness around the country, coast to coast, about what Donald Trump is trying to do in Texas. They are trying to intentionally discriminate against minority voters in Texas by tearing apart majority-minority congressional districts. Also, he can have more power and evade accountability and consequences. That's wrong, and we have to stand up and fight it.
Well, is it also wrong for other blue states, not necessarily the one where you are now, but New York, California, to pursue similar action in response? Does two wrongs make a right in this scenario?
Look, the wrong here is the fact that in Texas, the way they're going about this is to intentionally discriminate against Black, Hispanic, and Asian Texans by destroying their congressional representation in violation of the Voting Rights Act. I'm confident that, and the history shows that maps in those states you mentioned, California and New York, are in compliance with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the question is, are people going to follow the Voting Rights Act or are they not? In Texas, the Republicans are not doing that. And that's why we're here, and that's what matters the most.
Well, I suspect you've heard the headlines from the governor's office here. Greg Abbott has ordered the arrest of Democratic lawmakers who left the state, including yourself, saying Texas House Democrats abandoned their duty to Texans. Is this worth going to jail over?
I'm not going to go to jail. So the process actually is to establish a quorum in the House. The Speaker of the House has the right to issue a call on the House and issue civil arrest warrants. And that's what he's done this afternoon. That's no surprise. It's a civil arrest warrant, not a criminal arrest warrant. If someone were to come and get me, they would take me back to the House of Representatives, not to jail. But that's the reason I'm not in Texas right now. So they can't come and get me because they don't have authority outside of the state of Texas. That's why my colleagues and I have left the state of Texas. So as for the governor's bluster and rhetoric, look, I think he's just trying to show off for President Trump, and I don't take it terribly seriously.
Well, so you and your colleagues are not in Texas right now. I assume the intention is to remain outside of Texas until this special legislative session is over, but nothing's going to stop the governor necessarily from just calling another one. Representative, what's the plan after this? Can you do this in perpetuity?
No, we cannot do it in perpetuity, and no one is suggesting that we would. And of course, I fully expect the governor to call another special session. That is his prerogative as the governor. So I expect ultimately this fight is going to be decided in the courts because, as I say, the maps that they are trying to pass are in violation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But we want to use this fight and elevate this fight in a way that gets the attention of people across the country, voters across the country, so people understand what's at stake, what Trump is trying to do, the lengths he is going to seize more power so he can evade any accountability for his actions. And that's what we're doing.
Some have asked if Governor Pritzker in Illinois, who I know is hosting a good number of Democrats from Texas, might consider paying the $500 fine, the daily fine that apparently comes with your breaking quorum. Would you accept that?
No. We've not asked the governor to do that. He's not offered to do that, and no, I would not. Look, I'm not worried about the fines. I'm confident that we'll deal with that whenever, if it comes to that. But no, he is not, and no, I would not accept that.
All right, Representative, we appreciate you joining us here on Balance of Power. Democratic Texas State Representative Chris Turner, thank you so much. And of course, Joe, as we consider what's happening in Texas, knowing that the governor, Kathy Hochul of New York, today said she intends to fight fire with fire, talking about redrawing the maps. He seemed to suggest the difference is compliance with civil rights law. But I wonder if that's a difference the American electorate is going to make.
Great question. To the extent that people are paying attention to this outside Texas is a question in itself. But that's, I think, part of the point, right? This is why they fanned out across the country. You've got Chicago, you've got Albany, as well as Boston, where Democrats are beating the drum.
Not California yet, though, even though Governor Newsom is making a similar suggestion about California's own maps. This is, of course, a story we'll continue to follow. But coming up still ahead, President Trump is teasing his new timeline for naming a new Fed governor following Adriana Kugler's resignation. We'll bring you the details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I'll be announcing somebody for the filling of the person that left, but I think a Biden appointment. And she left early, and I think she left because she agreed with me on interest rates. We'll be announcing a new statistician sometime over the next 3 or 4 days. We had no confidence. I mean, the numbers were ridiculous.
President Trump just yesterday saying he will announce a new Fed governor in the coming days following Adriana Kugler's resignation. But What exactly will that process look like, and how could the Senate complicate matters? For insights, we turn to Bloomberg's Michael McKee in New York. Michael, we touched on this when it was breaking on Friday. Now that you've had a moment to think about it, what kind of hoops will the president need to jump through here, and the extent to which lawmakers might not sign off on a so-called loyalist?
Well, it's a very complicated situation for the president, because strategically he has to try to figure out whether he needs to fill this seat with the person he wants to become chairman when Jay Powell leaves office next May. If he does not, then it is possible that Powell stays on as a governor and he has no other seat to fill. So there are some intriguing options for the president. He could name whomever he thinks is going to be chair, and then presuming they are confirmed, they would sort of be a chair in waiting, and the markets would have to decide who to listen to, this person or Powell, until Powell is no longer the chair. It's the shadow chair thing that Scott Bessent has talked about. Or the president could appoint someone and say, I'm going to make a decision on a chair later, taking a chance that Powell will resign. And if he doesn't resign, he could say, I'm going to make a decision later and pick from either the person I just nominated or maybe Chris Waller or McKee Bowman, who were the two Fed governors appointed by Trump earlier, and sort of make it like The Apprentice, a situation where you tell two of those people you're fired and one of them gets the job.
Wow.
So obviously there are longer term considerations the president will make here, but in the more immediate term, Mike, is this likely to have any real bearing on the Fed's next rate decision in September?
Oh, none at all. I would be very, very surprised if Kugler's seat was filled by then. First of all, whoever it is going to have to fill out paperwork, and we know that takes a very long time before they can go through the confirmation process. Now, I suppose it might be easier for someone like Kevin Warsh, who had been a Fed governor, but he's going to have to update everything. And remember, he is an investor, and he's going to have a lot of holdings that he's going to have to disclose. Scott Bessent, I suppose, could get confirmed fairly quickly, but then you have to believe that he would want the job where the president would appoint him. So you start from behind in that case, and then you've got to go through the hearing process and then go to the floor. And when the Senate comes back, they're going to have the budget to deal with. Right now, there's talk of a government shutdown at the end of September, and that would take precedence over filling a Fed seat. So I think at this point, we're going to get to September, and it's going to be one vote short as it was this last time, and it isn't going to make any difference on what the Fed does.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael McKee, thank you so much for joining us. And obviously, while President Trump is set to name a new Fed governor, he has another role he needs to fill. He'll be selecting a new Bureau of Labor Statistics chief to replace Erika McEntarfer, who he fired last week after weak jobs data and revisions that he suggested without evidence were rigged. And joining us now here in our Washington bureau with more is Seth Harris, former acting labor secretary in the Obama administration and senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. He was also a former top labor policy advisor to President Biden. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Seth, if we could just first begin with this concept of rigging. Is it possible to rig BLS data? And I ask that not just looking back at what McEntarfer would have been able to do, but also with the suggestion that maybe the data isn't going to be reliable if President Trump can appoint a loyalist to the BLS. Can anyone do it?
No one person at BLS could possibly do it, especially the commissioner, who is not the person who puts together the statistics. This is not Erika McEntarfer sitting at her computer on her own, writing up a report and then sending it to the public. This is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people involved in survey collection, analysis, and statistical analysis. The other thing is the culture of BLS guarantees that if anybody tried to rig the numbers, you'd have dozens or hundreds of people pointing the finger and whistleblowing. So there's zero chance that these numbers were rigged. They were an honest reflection of a labor market that is slowing down dramatically under the Trump economic policies.
And a reflection of some late replies. We understand only 42% of the respondents got back to the government in time. And so when they had a flood of late replies, revisions were added. Kevin Hassett, whose name is on a very short list to be the next Fed chair, has been on television saying that those revisions equal the hard evidence that this was rigged. Could you trust a Fed chair who says that on behalf of the president?
I already don't trust Kevin Hassett, and that argument is preposterous.
How come?
We had 1 month of revisions that were especially large, and we usually don't see that kind of a number. But the other revisions of the other 2 months that were revised were not that big. They were consistent with what we've seen in the past. Let me just say there were revisions every month. We see it all the time, and that's because there are late replies to the surveys that BLS runs. We have updated information about seasonal adjustments. We have updated information about statistical imputations that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does. It's all ordinary business. And in the context of a labor market with 170 million Americans, an adjustment of 100,000 is less than 0.1%. If we could all be 99% accurate, we would meet the BLS standard.
Well, so when we consider the accuracy of the data going forward, and this kind of comes back to my original question, there was a suggestion over the course of the last several days that markets may not be able to have the same faith in the economic data put up by the U.S. government as they otherwise would in the aftermath of this. Should they still have the faith regardless of who the next BLS commissioner is?
Not regardless. I think it's very, very important who the president appoints to be the next BLS commissioner, because even though in any given month, at any given time, the commissioner can't change the results in a monthly employment situation report, over time, you can make a series of strategic decisions that would have an effect on the outcome. So I think there is real cause for concern. And whoever is nominated to that job is already under a cloud, because the President of the United States lied about what happened with this BLS commissioner. She did not rig the numbers. He said that to justify firing her, when, let me just say, he could have just fired her. There was no reason to make that false accusation against her. He doesn't want people to know the truth about the economy. But, you know, the American people, working people, they know what's going on. They know if there are jobs available to them. They know if their wages are going up. They certainly know if their prices are going up. They know that there's a lot of confusion around tariffs, so their employers don't know what to do. That's the problem, is firing the BLS commissioner accomplished absolutely nothing, and the president has now put the integrity of our statistical system at risk.
With that said, are you surprised to see Wall Street today? You would think that we'd be down 1,000 points having listened to the way that you just described this. But the market's on a tear. The VIX is down. Stocks are up. Where's the disconnect here? Because Republicans would say there's a lot of pearl clutching going on today over this. How would you respond to them?
I'm not surprised that they would say that. But let me just say, I don't make my judgments about whether or not there's a good policy or a bad policy or a good decision or a bad decision in government based on how markets respond. If there is a problem long-term with the firing of Erika McEntarfer, the BLS commissioner, we're going to see that evolve. We're going to have to see who President Trump appoints. We're going to have to see whether or not there is whistleblowing that goes on inside of BLS. We're going to have to see how that person talks about their job. If they truly are independent, which the BLS commissioner is supposed to be, then I think the markets would be right not to be concerned about it. But if, like everybody else seemingly that President Trump appoints, they only do his bidding and they don't worry about being responsible, being ethical, then I think the markets are going to be concerned.
Well, of course, the Federal Reserve hasn't been doing President Trump's bidding. He's been pushing for lower interest rates. The Fed has not yet delivered it. But as you speak to what this data and these revisions reveal, which is a softening labor market, do you think President Trump might actually have a point that perhaps the Fed should have acted sooner versus waiting for later?
I think it's a very interesting argument. You know, President Trump was complaining about numbers that are going to actually help him to accomplish his policy goal at the Fed, which is to get the Fed to move on interest rates. I think the odds of an increase of a slashing of interest rates have gone up. Not a slashing, maybe a 25 basis point cut, maybe a 50 basis point cut, although that would be leaning very, very far forward. You know, the problem that the Fed has is we saw inflation tick up and we saw the labor market slow down. There's a real risk of stagflation here. So they are in a situation where they have to move very, very, very cautiously. And let me just say, caution and Donald Trump don't belong together in a sentence.
Add the impact of tariffs, add the impact of continued mass deportations. Let's say 6 months to a year from now, what do monthly jobs numbers look like? We've had some tell us here that we could be down to a trickle. 10,000 a month wouldn't be an outlier in a world like that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's hard to overstate the disaster associated with the uncertainty caused by the tariffs and the catastrophic effects of these deportations on communities and workplaces all across the United States. People are petrified, justifiably so. We have masked, unidentified ICE agents going into workplaces and rounding up people who have been in this country for decades, some of them many decades, working responsibly, paying their Social Security taxes and their income taxes, contributing to our economy, and they're being thrown out of the country. That is not just morally wrong, but it is very, very bad for our economy. There seems to be no sign that either of these two deeply troubling economic policies, the tariff confusion that the president is causing, not to mention the actual effects of the tariffs on prices and other things, production in the United States, but the deportations are just going to kill us. Our economic growth depends upon having more people, not fewer. The president's going to throw a bunch of really good quality workers out of the country just because they have brown skin.
Well, when we consider the tariff aspect, knowing it is 3 days from now that we're supposedly going to start collecting the higher levies that President Trump announced on Friday, when does that actually start to more materially have an influence on the hiring and firing decisions that businesses are making when they're facing higher input costs and considering their own labor costs as well?
You know, I think it's very hard to predict because the president is extremely hard to predict. He puts the tariffs on, he takes the tariffs off. He makes it 50%, he makes it 10%. He says he strikes a deal. We never see the contents of the deal. Businesses really don't know what the sound decision is. You know, I'm telling you something you know very well because you work on this network. Capitalism depends upon transparency and certainty. And we have neither of those things with respect to the president's tariff policies. So once the tariffs begin to bite, what we're seeing in the labor market, which is employers are not laying off workers in large numbers. There's been an increase, but there's not been a dramatic increase. We will then see employers begin to make decisions about decreased output because they're not able to sell their products. They're going to have higher input costs. That means they may have to lay some people off. So that's what we want to monitor. Looking at the weekly initial unemployment claims number, which is something of a proxy for layoffs, I think is going to be a very important indicator for what's happening in the labor market with respect to employer decision making. Right now, they're kind of staying still, hoping that all this is going to pass. Yeah. But once they start making decisions, that will be an indicator that they're making the decision to lay people off.
Let's stay in touch on this. It's great to have you back. That's Seth Harris, former acting labor secretary in the Obama administration, senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. Thank you, as always. Coming up, President Trump's comments on the controversial American Eagle ad that sent shares soaring today. We'll bring you the details, and we'll turn back to the conversation on the Texas Democrats who fled the state to try to block their Republican colleagues' plan for redistricting when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lines. We'll have more on the news out of Texas and its redistricting battle, plus the president's decision on a new Fed governor when we convene our political panel in just a moment. But first, some of the other stories we're following in tonight's Power Brief. Tesla approved an interim stock award worth about $30 billion to CEO Elon Musk in what the company's board described as a good faith payment. The new agreement, which includes about 96 million shares of Tesla, will vest if Musk continues to serve in the top job for another 2 years. The Tesla board saying in a statement that losing Musk would, quote, not only mean the loss of his talents, but also the loss of a leader who is a magnet for hiring and retaining talents at Tesla.
Brazil's former President Bolsonaro has been ordered to be placed under house arrest by a justice of Brazil's top court. The court said he disobeyed a ban on using social media while standing trial for an alleged coup attempt. In 2023, Bolsonaro will be ordered to wear an ankle monitor and be under an evening curfew.
Cornell and Northwestern could be the next universities to finalize an agreement with the Trump administration after the federal government suspended research funds at the elite schools. The universities took steps to address major budget shortfalls earlier this year. Cornell and Northwestern are just two of a slew of universities rushing to cut deals with the White House as the fall semester approaches, with schools telling Bloomberg the unprecedented pressure campaign from the administration has led to large amounts of debt and layoffs.
An American Eagle shares soar, the stock surging as much as 16% in its biggest intraday gain since May after President Trump came out in support of the company's controversial Sydney Sweeney ad campaign. Trump using his social media platform, Truth Social, to call the Sweeney ad the, quote, hottest ad out there, adding without evidence that the company's jeans were, quote, flying off the shelves. I'm not sure what to do with that, but joining us now with reaction to this story and more, this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, a Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. I don't know if you want to weigh in on Sydney Sweeney.
Don't turn to me on that.
Apparently had the president's attention today.
It did.
To see the stock reaction was pretty remarkable here. But we've been talking about quite a number of issues here, including some of the news that took place on Friday with one ouster and one resignation that has left President Trump with two big seats to fill. A lot of question about what this means for the markets, as well as we were just discussing with Seth Harris, showing a lot of forgiveness at this moment. Are Democrats making too big of a deal out of it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's astonishing with the jobs he has to replace that he's got time for Sydney Sweeney and her jeans, but so he does. And I don't think anyone's making too big of a deal out of this. Yeah. You know, this is a statistician who was fired with absolutely no evidence that she did anything in terms of politicking. It is devastating to think that in the not so distant future, we could be living in a country in which we cannot trust numbers. Now, how do you make public policy if that's the case? So he has opened up, you know, put us down a rabbit hole, I think, and it is completely, you know, difficult to understand how the president could justify any of this. Does he have the power to do it? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But it is also terribly distressing to think that, you know, bureaucrats, statisticians are being treated this way and robbing us of our ability to trust in numbers.
Well, when we consider that Erika McEntarfer in particular was confirmed by the vast majority of the U.S. Senate, including people who are now members of the Trump administration, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio both voted to confirm her. It does point us to the fact, Rick, that both she and this new Fed governor will need to be confirmed. Obviously, President Trump hasn't had too much difficulty in getting his nominees through the process. But knowing that we're up against a government shutdown threat in September, how quickly do you expect these processes will even begin? And do you think there actually could be some hurdles of Republicans who might be worried about independence of our economic figures?
You know, there's a lot going on there. Just as a note, there have been a problem getting Donald Trump's appointees through the Senate confirmation process. In fact, that was a big fight that just ended on Friday with a no contest that now Republicans in the leadership are talking about coming back and pulling a nuclear option. In other words, changing the rule on confirmations to allow them to go through with only 51 votes, which, of course, gives them carte blanche on packaging all these confirmations and getting them through at the same time. So you have that underbelly of all the politics in the United States Senate around confirmations playing out. At the same time, you now have two really high-profile confirmations to add to that pile of over 100 confirmations that have not yet been processed. And it is bubbling up, right? I mean, you can feel the tension in Washington. You know, whether it's, you know, the Republicans fighting with each other on the Epstein situation, backed up work being done on not just confirmations, but also the budget, a potential government shutdown, and now all this new activity from the White House around, you know, the Fed and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's and this is all Republicans doing things to Republicans, right? This is not a Democrat versus Republican classic battle in the summertime between the parties. So I think that there's a lot to be done. Whether or not this administration can step out after Labor Day and really start to drive the train like they did after inaugural day is going to be a big question. But on the Sweeney thing, I mean, is that DNA or denim is the issue? That's my question.
I tried to give you a pass on that one, Rick. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what. It's the old-fashioned Democrats versus Republicans on full display in Texas right now as we get to the redistricting story. Earlier today on Fox News, Texas Governor Greg Abbott discussed the ongoing redistricting plans and addressed some of the criticisms that he's hearing from Democrats as he seeks 5 additional Republican seats. Listen.
First, for redistricting purposes, it's not done for racial reasons. However, the racial outcome is this, and that is the district lines will solidify the Barbara Jordan African-American district in the Houston area, and it will add 4 new Hispanic districts. And so there's actually going to be more racial minority districts in the state of Texas.
Well, this story has evolved quite a bit. By the way, 57 Democrats bailed on Texas. They broke quorum, so the redistricting process would be stopped here, realizing at some point they need to come home, and the governor will probably schedule another session. But now he's ordering their arrest as they seek shelter or refuge in places like Chicago, Boston, and New York. How does this end?
In the end, Democrats are going to have to return. Hopefully, he is not able to arrest them. But the reality is that Republicans in Texas have the numbers to do this. But the cynical way in which the governor is talking about this is preposterous. This is nothing to do with them addressing issues of districts for African Americans, Hispanics, and others. This is because the President of the United States is concerned that the GOP will lose the House in 2028. And he said, find me 5 more votes or 5 more seats, just like he said in Georgia, find me X number of votes. That's exactly what's going on. They have responded and they will do it. And this has, started a tit for tat because now Democratic states like New York, California, Illinois are threatening to do the same thing. And we're going to be in a period of just constant redistricting. Can you imagine the American public? How do you know who is your representative? Right. Not to mention you're being robbed of the ability to have a choice between a full-throated Republican and Democrat.
Well, so when you have Democratic lawmakers fleeing Texas to make the point that gerrymandering is wrong, at the very same time you have the New York Governor Kathy Hochul saying, no, we're going to do the same thing, fight fire with fire. Do the two counteract each other, Rick?
Yeah, I think Democrats are really playing the wrong card here because it's exactly what you described. Kathy Hochul, Gavin Newsom, both saying we're going to do exactly what Texas is doing, but we have to protect the Democrats in Texas because we're trying to stop that from happening. Look, gerrymandering is political. It always has been and always will be. Democrats do it, Republicans do it. Courts get involved. They tend to make it worse rather than better. We've never solved the problem of is there a commission that should draw these lines or should political people draw them? That is what we're living with. That is the country we live in. And so it shouldn't shock anybody that with this close a Congress that the states aren't going to do exactly what they always do, follow their own self-interest. The reality is what Texas has embarked upon is a dangerous plan. I've been through lots of redistricting. Part of being old is every 10 years. I've been through like 5 redistrictings. And so they always don't turn out like you thought they were going to. And so I've seen situations, and Texas has the potential of doing this, where you take 10 districts that are solid Republican and you make 5 new ones that are sort of marginal Republicans, but those other 10 now are marginal Republicans. And so all of a sudden in a close election, that's one thing. But in a blowout year where, Republicans are, not going to carry, you could wipe out that whole group.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And for more, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Great panel. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.